Okay, so we are welcoming some special guests tonight. Um, Most of us know them. I got a chance to work with them when Kofi was president of the branch, and his wife, Shireen, his lovely wife, Shireen, was the youth council advisor. So they are friends of the branch. They are friends of mine, and I am happy to welcome them back to give us quite an interesting topic and a timely topic. Um, on navigating bias, microaggressions, and racial trauma in the workplace. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them and their expertise.
This is on me to start.
I can stop sharing too.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We're just going to start sharing our screen. Notes. Make sure you can see the whole screen.
Okay. Can everyone see the full screen? Are you seeing the right screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Awesome. All right. Well, good evening again. I am Kofi, and again, this is Shireen, and we're so happy and to be able to join you guys this evening. There's a lot going on in the world, and you know, the issue of racial bias and racial trauma has been unfortunately front and center for the last few years. I think most people would agree that this issue has been exacerbated over the last few years for a whole wide range of issues. Some political and you know, police brutalities has been kind of dominating the headlines, and you know, just everything over the last few years has just been really traumatizing to a lot of people. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to have this discussion with you guys. We want to try to make it as interactive as possible. So feel free to throw questions in the chat or things like that, and we don't mind stopping. So just a little quick background about Fighting Words. So Fighting Words is a company that Shreem and I launched actually earlier this year. So it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting company that places a special emphasis on racial justice. So I know a lot of DEI companies are kind of generic in the way they do things, but given our backgrounds and personal experiences, we thought that there does need to be a special focus on specifically on racial justice in the DEI world. I actually saw an article just this morning that said that, you know, 70-something% of DEI professionals are white people. So something that's probably you know, you probably wouldn't expect, at least I didn't expect that number to be that high. You know, just given the fact that, you know, you think DEI and you might kind of automatically assume that it's people of color or that are kind of leading in this field, but there still needs to be work to be done even within the DEI field. And so we're hoping to be able to change some of that as much as we can. So our values, as you see there, are racial justice, collective liberation, community transformation, and accountability. And our mission is to increase diversity, promote equity, foster inclusion, and cultivate a culture of belonging.
Okay, so I'm gonna take over here and introduce Kofi and Shireen. So some of you may know us. So we are married and we are the proud parents of 2 college students. Omari is a senior and Jaden is a freshman at Virginia State University. We are co-owners of Fighting Words and Soul Rebel Food Truck. So some of you may know us from the food truck. I am a proud HBCU alum of the HU, which is Howard University. So if there's anyone on here from Hampton, I'm sorry, but Howard is the real HU. And Kofi is an alum of Tennessee State University. My day job, I am a DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Director for Elevance Health, also known as Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm a proud member of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. Kofi is an award-winning author. He's written 2 books. The first one is Bull in a China Shop, Evolution of a Racial Justice Activist, and Leadership in Action, 5 Key Principles of Effective Racial Justice Work. And we are both advocates for racial justice. All right, so as we begin this conversation, I would like to set some guidelines for our discussion and what I like to call inclusive practices. Because the topics we're going to be talking about, as Kofi mentioned, around racial trauma, microaggressions, bias, these are heavy topics. They can be triggers for some people. So we want to make sure that we're being respectful and mindful. We want to share our experiences. The best way to learn is through learning about each other's experiences. We want to be open-minded, contribute with courage. I encourage you to listen with curiosity and compassion. And most importantly, we want to preserve the integrity and confidentiality of today's conversation and really dig in and engage both heart and mind. So we're going to start out by talking about racial trauma. So I'm going to start out by reading a quote from Michelle Obama. She said, "Race and racism is a reality that so many of us grow up learning to just deal with. But if we ever hope to move past it, it can't just be on people of color to deal with it. It's up to all of us, Black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest, uncomfortable work of rooting it out." So as we hear that read, what are some of your reflections from hearing that quote? Anyone want to share?
Reem, I'm just thinking that what this says is it's about time people recognize it takes all of us, especially white people. And I have read Michelle Obama's 2 books, or finished this, almost finishing the second, and they're fabulous. Just in case anyone's interested in reading them. They're really good for all women, especially. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing.
Mhm.
I think that even when the so-called allies or liberal white folks, I mean, my experiences have been even those folks whom you expect to be allies, who position themselves as allies, really aren't. You know, it's hard. It's nice to say you're an ally, but when your actions and your words prove otherwise, when I generally work in spaces that you would think we wouldn't have a problem, it's just not that it's harder to navigate, but as I'm getting older, I just don't want to hold my tongue, keep the peace, smile, and pretend. I find it's just getting harder for me to do that.
Thank you for sharing and for your courage and vulnerability. Yeah, so as she said, it takes all of us, right, to rooting it racism out. One thing that I realized for me personally, the piece where she says growing up learning to deal with it, I personally feel like, you know, in recent years, reflecting on my childhood, I personally was dealing with some racial trauma. I didn't know it at the time and didn't really understand it in that way. But for an example, I grew up and going to a dance school, starting at the age of 3. And there were some incidents that happened, you know, in that dance school, and how the few Black kids that attended that dance school were treated. And I think I carried some of that with me, right? From a childhood to adulthood, around confidence and putting myself out there sometimes, but because of the fear of not being good enough. So you know, these things do tend to follow us. So it's always good to have these conversations and name it. So looking at the definition of racial trauma is race-based traumatic stress. It's really the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health. It has been observed in numerous BIPOC communities and people of all ages, including young children. Racial trauma can be experienced vicariously or directly. And it has been linked to feelings of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, as well as other physical health issues. So when we look at the sources of racial trauma, there are many sources of racial trauma. Two things we're going to dig into later today: the racial microaggressions and bias, especially when it's repeated. Historical systems and structures, the work environment. We definitely see it there. You know, law enforcement, unfortunately, we've seen that in the last couple of years, even before that. Discrimination when people are looking, you know, to get promoted, seeking benefits, accessing services in the schools, in politics, and really, I think has been really pronounced in the news, media, social media, videos. More so in the last few years, since now we have, you know, iPhones and things of that nature. So as we reflect over the past few years, I'm sure we can think of many examples of some of the sources of racial trauma. So just wanted to engage you all here and see if there's any examples that you want to bring into the space. Oh, I can offer, obviously, we're going to talk about this a little later, but all the different recent killings of Black and Brown by police officers. That is definitely something that has been front and center over the past few years. That has definitely been a source of racial trauma, and we've, you know, obviously seen those through the media. And it just continues to manifest. So thinking about the racial trauma, you know, racism manifests itself in a lot of different ways. We see it systemically with policies, procedures, and practices. There's institutional racism, things like the Jim Crow segregation laws, the criminal justice system, educational systems. Overt racism, where you have unequal access to employment, housing, health, voting ability. Covert, which is racial profiling. Aversive would be impacts on decision-making, such as employment decisions, legal decisions. And also internalized, where you have that self-hatred and internalized negative stereotypes about yourself. I think I saw a hand up. Meg, did you want to come off mute?
Yeah, that was me. It was really on your last point where you were looking at lists of types of the causes of trauma. And it seems to me that right in this era, another cause of trauma can be misdirected attempts at talking it all out, and bad DEI training, as you point out, may be going on. And some of the efforts, genuine or not, at reconciliation, if you will, that are really not very well managed and nor designed. I'm reacting a little to the first comment of, gee, you know, where did my allyship go wrong? God, what did I do? But who did I traumatize? But certainly there's a risk in all the kinds of brave efforts you're taking right now with us. So.
It's a great point.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can you help me to understand the difference between the systemic and the institutional racism? They seem to overlap, I think.
Yeah, and I do think some of these do overlap. When we look at systemic, we're looking more at policies, so governmental policies, procedures, and practices. And to your point, yes, institutional can also be systemic as well, because we look at the criminal justice system, right? And that is definitely both, systemic and institutional, but they do have them separated.
And I believe, if, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the systemic doesn't necessarily have to come from a law necessarily. It could just be something that's just kind of over time, we all live in systems like that. The way we operate, the way our society functions, there are systems that guide those things. And so when racism kind of takes root, which it obviously has in all of these systems, then it manifests differently in different situations. So it may not necessarily come from an institution per se, but it's just kind of ingrained within our systems. That's kind of the way I think about it.
Not necessarily able to see all the hands, so that I'm not sure if there's any other hands, but before I move on, is there any other questions or comments?
Sure, I'll make a comment. I think racism is a failure to be your brother's keeper.
That's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that.
I think it's caring more about your own comfort than comfort of everyone around you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'd like to bring up something, sure, if you don't mind. What just happened in Memphis, Tennessee, even though those Black officers beat that Black young man basically to death, I still think that, like it was a racism because it stems from a police culture. They were ingrained in the police culture, which was about putting Black people down. And I mean, I may be wrong, but can you comment on that?
Go ahead. You were going to bring it up later. Kofi's going to bring that up a little later, but I'll let him talk about it.
I don't mean to jump the gun.
No, you're fine.
No, it's a great point. And I think I actually reserved a little bit of time to talk specifically about that incident a little later. So let's put a pin in that for now, if you don't mind.
All right, thank you. So, as we're hearing all of these, as we continue to talk about, racism and racial trauma and all of these, we're going to talk about bias, we're going to talk about microaggressions. I would encourage us all to take a collective deep breath, because it is very important. And one thing I want to reiterate as we go through this discussion is the importance of self-care. That is really, really important as we continue to deal with these traumas. And just want to lift a quote really quick that talks about healing racial trauma requires a self-care and community care response. So, self-care, doing things like meditation, journaling, talking to someone, whether that be a professional therapist or a friend, about these traumas. Community care is also important. How do we take care of the well-being of each other as a community, physically and emotionally? Examples, holding vigils when events happen, having community conversations like we're having now. Those are all part of that community care. So I just wanted to, as we move on to the next topic, wanted to just bring that into the space. And I'm going to turn it over to Kofi to talk through examining bias.
Yeah. Before I actually get into that, I just want to kind of give a little personal testimony about like the importance of taking care of yourself and self-evaluation, trying to make sure you're okay. So at kind of like the heart of the George Floyd protest, I was, went to work one day, and I had a coworker. This is before pre-food truck. I had a coworker ask me, how I was doing, just kind of casually, just like how folks normally just say, "Hey, how you doing? What's going on?" And like for whatever reason, I just like froze up and I couldn't actually answer him. And I actually, like, we were just like in the cafeteria, and I was like started crying. And I had to like leave work that day because I realized, like, in that moment, like everything, I was just holding in a lot of emotions because of everything that was going on. And I didn't even realize it. And so sometimes these things come out, and these emotions are tugging at you in ways that you don't even necessarily realize. This is very, painful, deep, heavy stuff that we're dealing with. And so it's okay, check in with yourself and check in with your friends, particularly the ones doing the work, particularly the ones who are directly impacted by it, by these traumas. The trauma doesn't always, it's not always evident, so especially your NAACP leadership here. There's a lot riding on their shoulders, a lot of stressful days and nights and weekends and things that they're shouldering, burdens that they're shouldering. So take some time to thank them and for the work that they're doing. All right, so examining bias. So there's a writer, Anais Nin, who said, "We don't see things as they are; we see things as we are." And so that's essentially what bias, that's kind of gets to the heart of how bias works. I want to, before we get into explanations or more into the meat of this presentation, that part of the presentation, I wanted to kind of ask a couple questions just to kind of get some feedback from you as to try to gauge how you guys think bias works. So just my one or two folks, how do you think bias works?
When you have an experience, you assume it might keep happening the same way, or those people in any group are all the same. So you may have that bias. It could be in any way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a failure of humility. We just want to assume that we are right without really stopping and checking ourselves. And I think that's something we have to do constantly, no matter who we are. Check and double check your assumptions and where you're coming from, because there's probably a lot of underlying crud that you need to get rid of.
Having an expectation that you might have had for a long time, and then realizing that expectation of what somebody else should or shouldn't do is offensive, but it's rooted in I guess like in the growing up process. I think I'm essentially describing stereotypes.
There's definitely overlap. We're actually going to talk about how stereotypes come into play when we're talking about bias. So it's not wrong.
How about if you have an opinion, strongly held opinion, so strong you can't accept another person's opinion?
I think bias might be part lack of knowledge, ignorance, and part cutting others down to your own size. An inherent feeling of inferiority, and so you want everybody else to be less than you.
Okay.
I'd like to volunteer myself that bias, I think, for me works unconsciously. And it may not always be a negative bias. If I'm talking to someone and I met them for the first time and I like the cut of their jib or whatever, why do I like them? Or if I don't like the cut of their jib, like, what is it? Is it heuristics like we were mentioning earlier, like our life experiences, or is it something else? But I think for me and maybe for others, it could be working unconsciously.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Do we all have biases?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
All right, that was easy. Okay, is it always bad?
No.
Anyone want to volunteer? A thought as to whether or not it could be always bad to have biases.
Well,
If somebody tells me they're a member of the NAACP, I'm going to be biased in their favor until they prove otherwise, you know?
I'm thinking that bias is a form of judging. You know, you're judging others. And so generally the human tendency is to judge negatively, but you can, probably doesn't happen a lot, but you could judge positively.
I remember a work colleague saying for when he was travel for work, he would always wear a coat and tie because you know, if his flight was delayed or whatever, and he'd go to the counter, the checkout counter, and he'd need a new seat or whatever, he always felt like he got better service than when he was traveling, you know, on vacation travel, and he was just in shorts and a flip flop. So, you know, that's kind of him using the ticket counter person's bias to get better service, if you will.
Ah, sorry, using a bias to get something you want. All right, that's interesting. Okay, that's a lot of great examples there. So it can be both, or it doesn't have to be, right? So it could be positive or it could be negative, but the bottom line is, like, it's unconscious. I think someone mentioned earlier that it's an unconscious thing. So it's important to realize that we all have biases, right? And these things come from our background, right? So it's a natural phenomenon. Like, we all, you know, depending on, you know, all of our life experiences, everything that made us who we are today shape how we view the world, right? So for example, if you're you know, if you're walking down the street at night and, you know, you see a group of guys who maybe look a little shady or whatever to you, right? Like, it's not necessarily, it is a bias that you are now looking at this group of men, you know, that are potentially a source of harm, but that comes from things that you've seen or heard over the years that have been implanted in your brain. And so now how you treat that information, or how you treat that feeling, is what's important. But you have to, you know, but acknowledging that you're feeling a certain way is the key, right? So it's basically like our brain taking shortcuts, right? So instead of having to, like, figure out, you know, a really complex problem every single time, your brain sometimes just takes a shortcut and tells you this is the best decision to make, right? Sometimes that can actually be a good thing. So for instance, let's say you're driving down the street and, you know, you see a group of kids playing on the sidewalk, kicking a ball. You might automatically tap the brakes because you're thinking that there's a possibility that maybe they'll kick the ball into the street, or maybe they might run into the street. And without even processing the information, you might say, you know, you might not have the time to say, okay, do I need to, are these kids old enough? Are they kicking the ball hard enough? Or how skilled are they? Like, the time it'll actually take you to process all the relevant information might, cause you to a delayed reaction, right? So sometimes biases could actually be helpful, right? So that's a situation where, you know, but the bottom line is you can't really help it. Your culture, your background, your social circles, who you hang out with, your politics, which we'll get into a little bit more in a couple slides. These things all impact how you view the world and how you make decisions. And so I'll use myself as an example here too. So one time I was actually doing some fundraising for NAACP banquet, back in the day. And I went into this restaurant, and I was trying to get them to sponsor some raffle tickets or something like that. And there were like about 3 or 4 Black workers in there, and there was 1 white worker. And I automatically assumed and walked up to the white worker, assuming that they were the manager of the restaurant. And the second I did it, I wanted to smack myself. Like I felt really bad that I made that assumption, but whatever in my background led me to think that drove me to have that bias. So like it's just recognizing that we all can have these biases. We all, and sometimes we all act on them. And we just have to catch ourselves, right? We're all subject to this is how society works. This is how, and so don't beat yourself up too much. Just try to learn from it and recognize it when it's happening. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there a difference between, a harmless, non-offensive bias versus a malicious bias? What do you think?
I really think it's too general of a question to really give an answer. I really think it depends on the situation, and more specifically, it depends on the person and how they feel. So if they feel like they've been harmed by it, then, and no 2 people are the same, right? So if person A feels like they've been disrespected by it or hurt by it, then it was bad, right? If person B, similar demographics or whatever, or don't have a problem with it, then so I don't think it's a question that I can give a really thorough answer to without knowing the exact situation.
Okay, what I'm saying basically is that sometimes biases cause people to act in harmful ways towards another person.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
that's a malicious bias, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, if you're causing harm, then it's bad, so just, there, but I guess what I'm saying is, like, unless you have like a more specific example of the thing that was said or done, but generally speaking, if it's negative and you're making someone feel bad, then yeah, I would agree that is malicious. So the drawbacks, I think, to your point, is that even though we all have these biases, we all tend to make these mistakes. At some point, we're all gonna have a slip up where we do something based on our previous experiences that hurts someone. These are the drawbacks. So decisions that are made sometimes that are at odds with logic, meaning there's tons of information to show that this shouldn't be, this doesn't make any sense, but we do it anyway. So I threw up the Dallas Cowboys star up there. So I'm not sure if you have any Cowboys fans in the house, but every year, despite all of the data and logic that says that they're not going to the Super Bowl, they really believe they're going to go to the Super Bowl. It happens every year. It will happen again next year, but it's a bias, right? It's okay. You're a fan, and we understand, but it's okay because the Washington Commanders are in the same boat. We also have 20 plus years of terrible football, and we still follow our team faithfully. But here we are.
Excuse me. How would you define the difference between bias and perception?
Bias and perception. I think your biases are based on your perception. I might have to go to the Webster's dictionary on that one. But so your perceptions are, built up feelings and thoughts about how and so it shapes how you interact with the world. And so that is where I think where the bias could be developed. So this second bullet here, I think, is also important. The fact that some of these things are exacerbated during when we're fatigued or stressed, right? Which is a lot of times, again, you need to make a really quick decision and you're under duress, right? Again, police officers, right? So if you don't have 10 minutes to figure something out, you have 2 seconds to figure something out or less to make what could be a life or death decision. If you have biases, that is exactly the time when you might act on those biases, right? So if you think your life is in danger because you automatically assume that a Black person, a Black male is a threat, then you might make the wrong decision, because at that time you're fatigued and you're stressed and you're multitasking, you're doing 5 different things, and this is the type of things that happen, right? So sometimes, that's not to excuse the behavior, that's just to say this is how it happens, right? A lot of times we need to have conversations with these police and these departments to let them know, like, hey, there's a science behind why you're doing what you're doing, right? Let's not, you're not necessarily make you a bad person all the time. It just means that your brain is working the way that it was designed to, so, and if you don't challenge yourself, then we have to, then we end up with repeated behavior. So we'll talk a little bit more about police in a minute. All right, so a couple examples to run through. What comes to mind when you see this image? Go.
I can think of an experience that I had as a child, as a teen. I'm sorry, but I'm not camera ready right now, but I'm talking. I grew up during the 60s, and I was the only Black in my high school grade. And I can recall walking home from school. I had to walk through a white neighborhood, and sometimes people would have dogs to run after me. To this day, I am terrified of dogs. And it was actually almost 3 years ago. I was in Virginia Beach, walking on the beach early in the morning with a niece. She wanted to walk, and I said, okay, as long as dogs are not there. So she said, Aunt Joyce, this is the time that dogs are not going to be there. And I said, okay. So we started walking. I saw a dog, loose dog. I was terrified. I just froze. And I said, please get your dog. Please get your dog. And then I just started reliving what I had experienced as a 13, 14-year-old. And to this day, I'm very serious. Any type of dog, it takes me back to that moment. I feel like I had been suppressing it for years. I mean, I never had a dog, never wanted a dog, but just to see a dog, to hear a dog. And yeah, so that's when I look at this dog, it takes me right back.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and definitely understand. Anyone kind of automatically assume that this dog is dangerous, as a threat?
Well, this is a pit bull.
Yes.
And the breed is known to be aggressive, but I have a niece who has a pit bull, and he's the gentlest dog in the world. So my bias has changed to think of this as an animal that you just have to get to know, because they may be very gentle and not the bias of aggressiveness that I was taught previously.
Yeah.
I guess when I see a pit bull, every time I read a story about a dog attacking severely and killing a child or someone, it is a pit bull. So I'm basing it on the experience, and my kids are always like, that's ridiculous. I'm like, no, it's not ridiculous. And that's my strong belief. So that scares me to see that dog.
Yeah. No, I think that the both comments were really spot on there. A lot of people are like both of you who see pit bulls like myself, if I saw a pit bull right now, I may not run the other direction, but I'll be a little more attentive than maybe if I saw this dog. I don't recall ever hearing a story about a lab attacking or killing anybody or anything like that. They're typically not bred for that. They're typically not involved in like dog fights and things like that. So yeah, this dog could be very friendly and this dog could be vicious, but you know, here's where your brain is going to take a shortcut in a stressed out moment, and you're going to make a decision that's probably based on your experience, you know. Unless you're Shireen and she hates all dogs and she sees every dog as a threat, but most of us will make some kind of a distinction. One more. What do you see when you see this image?
I see we get two really bad haircuts for one.
But kids playing, anything?
I see two children playing.
Yeah.
Two children playing. When I look at the photo, you know.
How about this image? Evoke any different thoughts? Remember, there's no right or wrong.
Not without any context. Not without any context. No, I don't. I see the same thing because one is smiling, the other one is, you know, I can't really see his face.
I see those kids on the right as being groomed for something really terrible. I don't mean on the right, I mean on the left. I'm sorry, I got crossed. The white kids look like, you know, future MAGAs to me, and scary as hell.
Yeah.
This part with the hair, I don't know.
I just don't see that when I see the picture.
Well, you're
Yeah,
probably,
I just don't see that when I see the picture. I would need to have a little bit more context to it.
yeah, my bias goes crazy. It's not in the picture. It's not at all in the picture. I see hair. I don't know about that hair.
I see the ones on the left. Particularly that one kid scares me because I'm thinking, whatever he's got in that pistol, if it's a Nerf or water or whatever, he's going to hit me because he's focused on me. Kids on the right, they're just playing with each other. They don't care what's going on with me.
Yeah.
And then the other kid on the left, he's looking at the one kid. He's like, whatever he does, he's going to do the same thing. So I'm in deep trouble if the one kid.
Either way, you're going down, right? So I think those are really interesting responses, you know. So I think this crowd might be a little bit different, but I think depending on where, you know, different crowds, different audiences might react differently, right? The kids on the left, they're Iraqi kids, and this picture was taken in the middle of the some of the war in Iraq. I think some people might look at that picture and see potential long-term grooming for some kind of terrorist activity. But depending on your perception, here in America, we see some white kids and playing with guns, and we have, because the majority of like mass shootings probably have been perpetuated by white males, maybe that shapes your view as to like what these kids are doing. And it could just be you know, a group of kids all just having fun, harmless, you know, friendly, you know, things like that. But depending on what your background is, you might see something different depending on where you're from, where you're coming from. Again, that sounds like just harmless, you know, fun. But here we have the picture of, you know, this incident where Tamir Rice, a young Black boy, was killed by an officer while playing with a toy gun, right? Depending on where his background and his, you know, experiences led him to think that this kid was a threat to him, and Tamir Rice was unfortunately gunned down because of it. Political influence on bias. So I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit. I know we're using up a little bit of time here. How are we doing on time, Michelle?
I'm riveted, so you're doing fine on time.
Okay. All right, so political influence on bias. So yeah, so part of there's four main ways that politics influences our bias. So the first is partisan polarization, us versus them situations. We tend to think that we're better than them. They are less deserving of things. They're less trustworthy, and we see this actually playing out in our world all around us every day, right? There was a research done by, I think it was, forgot the institution now, but it showed that your likelihood of taking the COVID vaccine, the strongest determinant as to whether or not you're willing to take the COVID vaccine was your politics, right? So we have this global pandemic, and it's not your age, it's not your gender, it's not your race. Whether or not the strongest determinant whether or not you took the vaccine was whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Like that to me seems crazy, but that's who we are, right? And we're just getting more and more polarized every day. There was a lot more overlap between Democrats and Republicans. Now, 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median, the middle, middle ground, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median. So we're just become, and that is the strongest it's been in ever. So we're not just sensing the polarization, we are actually experiencing it. It is real. We are a much more divided country now than ever before. That's how it is. So again, you have the image there of the Stop the Steal. We talked about how people are willing to ignore facts and whether or not what you believe is based on your politics. You have still a large majority of Republicans who felt like the election was stolen from them, and that lie is still perpetuating, and so it's still kind of going on right now, and that's just how these things can manifest. Confirmation bias. Even though we have more access to information than ever before, we are actually, what the internet and search engines and social media has actually done was actually just made us dig deeper into the things that we like, because all these algorithms, even your searches, what you search, what your search results on Google are not the same as my search results on Google, right? So nothing that we actually receive is unbiased. It's just confirming what we already believe. All of these information sources are designed to just give us what we want to see, not open us up to the world. And I saw a really interesting stat that said that 90% of the information produced on the internet today was produced in the last 2 years. Like crazy. Imagine just imagine just how much information is being pumped every day. Every day there's a new YouTube video. Every day there's a new blog or a new this or so. It's just so much more ways you can if you whatever you believe, if you want to look up just cats with black tails, like you can only find cats with black tails. Like you don't have to venture out and see cats with white tails, so there's just more room for confirmation bias. Stereotyping, here we go. So we're things like race come into play, right? So you all remember the story of the welfare queen, Miss Linda Taylor, who was dubbed the welfare queen by then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. That thing that basically it took a stereotype and it used politics, and now that led to more racism, and now that actually led to policy changes. So down the fourth bullet, where we talk about how these things manifest into policies. Now we have stricter policies about benefits, social benefits, because of the built on a stereotype which is based on politics. So very dangerous, but we're all a victim to it, a victim of it. Okay. So we'll talk about police brutality a little bit here. Black people are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience to be killed by police than white people. And it's also important to know every time we hear about someone being killed, you could almost imagine that there are probably 10 use of force cases that don't result in someone's death, right? And I've just threw the number 10 out there, and I don't actually know if that's actually factual or not, but there's always going to be more use of force cases than killings for obvious reasons. So you could imagine if Black people are 2 to 3 times more likely to be killed, you could also assume that there are that many more people who are having force used against them unjustly because of their race, right? Black people are almost 30% of those killed by police, even though we make up about 13% of the population. And we're much more likely to be killed while unarmed, unfortunately, like the situation we just saw here in Fairfax County. So the gentleman, or someone, forgive me, had brought up the issue of the Memphis killing of Tyree Nichols a few weeks back. And I thought this was a really interesting case. So I'm really glad it was brought up, because I do want to take some time to open up the floor to kind of hear some thoughts about how and why that happened. Because this was a very different, usually we see a white officer killing a Black man, and we've seen this so many times that for a lot of people it was a little bit of shock to the system to see that Black officers, a group of them, did this in such a brutal way. So what are your thoughts about this, and how do you think bias, systemic racism played a role?
One aspect of that situation certainly had to do with toxic masculinity. I think that was one of the major determinants as to how they got into that mindset. And just generally speaking, particularly in American culture, just how we respond or react to being in positions of authority. It makes me think back to the infamous, I believe it was Stanford experiment. People with Stanford, the young men who were placed in the position of being the prison guards. You just give folk a badge and a gun and a title. They just tend to misuse it. And then on top of that, just the toxic masculinity that we're seeing, that particularly in with Black males, where we are taught to be tough, to be strong, and you don't take nothing from nobody, and to have feelings as a sign of symbolic of being weakness. You put all those things together in a pot, and then you end up with Memphis.
I would like to add to that. When I saw the video, the first thing that I noticed is that when they pulled him over, Tyree had asked them, why am I being stopped? And it was just automatically, they were just so aggressive. And so already they're coming at it negatively. And so that's, putting him on guard, right? Because it's like, I'm just asking a simple question, which is valid, about, hey, just asking why you stopped me. And then it just proves that this goes back to the very first slide, I think, when we were talking about systems, and how it's like this, no matter what color an officer is, they're in a system, they're in a culture, and the system responded how it was intended to respond, which was with overly being aggressive with someone who is non-white, because I don't think they would do that. And the fact that this was a particular unit that was developed to handle high crime areas and whatnot, so they came at it in a very aggressive manner.
I like to say, when you look at systems and cultures, when you look at 3 of the 5, there's a lot of culture behind that because 3 of the 5 were Omega Psi Phi fraternity. I being a Greek individual, there's certain things that we do when we pledge. So they had a culture of anyone that's an Omega person and you've been on campus. I'm a golden soror. So there's certain things that people go through during the pledging process. That's part of the culture. It becomes ingrained in the system. And those are some of the things that we're trying to undo. And quite naturally, they were eradicated or taken off of their fraternal roles. But the other thing that I think we make the assumption about that we really haven't talked about in terms of bias, I think as an African American, we often assume all we have this affinity, and we need to recognize that all skin folks ain't kin folks. So we want to say because, you expect a certain amount of sympathy because somebody is Black, that they're going to react another way towards another African American or marginalized individual. And that's not the case. That's strong bias that we have, that I find that I have to rid myself out of. I have to tell myself time and time again, all skin folks ain't kin folks. So I heard the individual talk about masculinity, toxic. I never heard that one before. So that's a new one I'm writing down in my book. But I do think that inherently in the police system, that there is a lot of physicality because it's warranted for the job. However, I do think given the opportunity to think, to walk away, because we know usually, data shows if there's a woman there that people usually aren't as forceful in terms of an encounter of arrest if there's a woman in the mix.
Thank you. Thank you. Will, you had your hand raised.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Oh, I just wanted to say real quick. So the term toxic masculinity, I think, especially when we're describing Black men, we have to learn how to be careful. So there's often, you see it in the media, you see it in certain communities where we're painting Black men as being toxic, right? We're raised tough, we're raised macho. Well, a lot of us grew up in tough environments, so we had to have some type of tough nature to get through the situations that we went through. I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York City, right? So during the 80s, 90s, right? It just was a tough environment. But does that mean that that's toxic? Does that mean I bring negative traits? Does that mean I'm going to rob or hurt somebody? No, not at all, right? So I'm an educated man. I'm doing fine, right? And so are like a dozen of my friends who came from the same environment. But often you see that picture is painted on young Black men. So as a community, as we're on this call, we also have to do our part not to perpetuate that stereotype. There are a portion of us that come from environments that we had to be a little tough. Maybe we had to have a chip on our shoulder, but that chip or that toughness, quote unquote, is what allowed us to survive those environments and turn out to be good fathers and professionals and teachers, et cetera. So that's the only point I want to make, because I hear it so often and it bothers me. But as a community, let's try to self-check each other when it comes to that. We don't want to push that and give others an excuse to use that to harm us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Will. Appreciate that. Shavli?
Oh, sorry.
Hey, so in that incident, one of the thoughts that kind of came to me is that there's an us versus them kind of thinking where, which permits you to do violence against another person when you don't see them as part of your group. You were talking a little bit about groups and what affinities there are. So there's layers of groups that I see, Black men here, you have Black men, and that's one group. But then, and somebody was talking about, the sororities and fraternities and pledgings, that's a different kind of group and affinity. Then in the police force itself, there's the us versus them affinity that happens. And if the police force's training is such that they're seen as separate instead of being a part of the community doing the policing, it really lends itself to this the capacity to do violence against citizens and people that are out there. So that was my thought on that.
Thanks, Jamily. Les, I'm gonna jump to you, but I'm also gonna throw another kind of follow-up question here. A lot of the times we hear that one of the solutions to preventing police killings of Black people is to hire more Black officers, right? This seemed to be an indictment on that, on that concept, and so I'm throwing up the question out to Les and anyone else who wants to comment on that.
Yeah, if I may, this situation reminded me of something I experienced when I lived in Jerusalem. And I was talking to some Palestinians who expressed how they were more, although there was not as many Arab members of the Israeli Defense Forces, they were more concerned when they ran into an Arab member of the IDF than a Jewish member of the IDF. And there was this this strange psychology, at least in their perspective, that the Arab members of the Israeli Defense Forces were trying to really kind of compensate for the fact that they were a minority by being even more Israeli than the Jewish Israelis, if I can, and it manifested itself, according to a lot of the people I spoke to, in greater brutality.
That's interesting.
It just makes me wonder about the psychology. If you're in a minority community, there's often that reality that you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And I wonder sometimes about the psychology working in a negative way, where are you trying so hard to be part of the in-group or whatever you see as the majority group that you're compensating in a negative way? And I don't know if that's what happened here with the situation in Memphis or not, but I could see that playing out potentially, in which case, like you were saying, just getting more minority officers isn't going to be the solution. The solution has to be also training people to see people as part of the community and not as others, as someone already said. So.
Yeah. I want to make sure we're mindful of time. So I see 3 hands raised. I want to get to those 3. And so the order I want to get to it is Les Shockley, Diana, and Arthur Purvis. And then we'll have to move on from there. But I'll give some closing remarks in a minute. So, but go ahead, Les.
He's on mute.
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't speak earlier, but I see this as more systematic when it comes to police, because there are a number of police chiefs around this country who are Black and are Black women as well. And yet, I think that in many instances, they bleed blue because of the system that's in place. When situations arise, the knee-jerk reaction is to defend their officers. Memphis was unique, and there are good reasons for that. But I mean, we can look right here at Fairfax County and be shocked that in this progressive county, that police would shoot a person for stealing glasses who is unarmed. And there in this progressive county we live in, again, headed by a white police chief, that it's still, that default reaction is that protecting property is more valuable than protecting life. I want to also kind of react to the point one lady made about the fraternity. I mean, I'm Kappa Alpha Psi, but I think the Omega Psi Phi people came out and disowned what they did, but I would not attribute their the hazing that they went through to the actions as police officers. I mean, that is not a connection I would make. And training, we're going to hear this. We hear it time and time again when these things go wrong. It's training. It's training. It's training. You know, this is unacceptable at this stage because this happens time and time again around this country. And the default response that you talked about early, or about the 2 seconds or the 10 seconds, that is just to react and shoot, because why? There's no accountability. There's no accountability in this country. We have the rare cases where there is, but for the most part, police are able to kill with impunity.
Diane?
Yeah, all these comments are very, very valid. You know, the example, I don't know who was saying it, about the Israeli and I guess it was Palestinian officers and trying to prove they're one of the group and all that made a whole lot of sense. And just being part of the part of what goes on in these police forces, it comes from the top, I think. But that's really all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Arthur?
Hey, I realize this does not 100% apply to this discussion, but I think note ought to be made about the extreme violence used by Hollywood and entertainment media to entertain with violence. That cannot help.
Thank you. Thank you. This obviously is a really rich conversation, needs to be had on police reform. I'm sure you guys have had several conversations in the past. So I know we aren't doing that incident justice or the whole topic of police violence justice in this very short, brief conversation, but in the interest of time, I do need to move on. But I think that the comments that were made were really, really powerful. And I think from a lot of different angles, the thing that stood out to me the most in this, okay, so I grew up in DC in the 90s, and the police force there was majority Black at the time. And I've seen police brutality perpetuated by Black people against Black people more times than I should have. I know this is the case in a lot of cities, inner cities, all right? So like me seeing that Memphis video, it was triggering, but it was also not surprising as it was to a lot of people, because there is what I think is a false narrative that if you put Black people in the police force, then they will automatically be more aware, more conscious, more sensitive to interactions with Black people. But again, we're talking about systemic issues here, and the cultural bias and the racism is to not treat Black people the same way, right? So regardless of what skin color you are, you can still internalize. We talked about internalization. You can still internalize some of those same biases, some of those same racism, and that means that you can still look at another Black person the same way that a white person does. You might still see the same thing. So it's important we can't just put Black bodies in these positions and just assume that all is well if you don't take time to teach and change the culture of the organization and the systems and how they operate. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox real quick on that one. I love to, we know we could talk all day on that one. Okay, and so I'm briefly gonna hand it over to Shrem to talk over to how bias shows up in the workplace.
So I'm gonna try to I know we're way over time, so I'm gonna try to speed through the rest of this as fast as I can. So just wanted to pivot to how bias shows up in the workplace. I've been in HR for the past 20 years. and have witnessed many of these types of biases that show up in the workplace based on the work that I do. Looking at recruitment and hiring, I've had hiring managers who are only looking to hire individuals from certain schools, Virginia Tech being one of them. Great school. However, that was one of the biases that I dealt with in one of the organizations I supported, where that engineering manager only wanted to hire engineers from Virginia Tech. Looking at promotions, sometimes that similarity bias comes in where managers are looking to promote those that may look the part or a certain way and maybe behave similar to them. The other way I see bias showing up a lot is in compensation. Done lots of analysis in compensation and see that, you know, a lot of times you have Black employees who are getting paid way less than their white counterparts, and some of those Black individuals having more education, more work experience than their white counterparts. So some of the feedback I would hear from some of my hiring managers was sometimes that these individuals negotiated better when they came on board. So that's why they started out with a higher salary, which is not something that I necessarily believed, but that is something that these are the way some of these biases show up in the workplace. So I'm going to move on to how to navigate some of those biases at work. And I'm going to call out Will here because he actually modeled very beautifully earlier a tactic that we call calling in and calling out. It's a way to interrupt bias. Calling out is bringing public attention to an individual, group, or organization's harmful words or behaviors. When we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable or will not be tolerated, or when we need to interrupt in order to prevent further harm. It allows us to hit the pause button and break the momentum. So just wanted to shout that out to Will because he modeled it before I can even get to it. But that is definitely a way that you can interrupt some biases there. Calling in is more of an invitation to talk to someone one-on-one, or maybe having a small group conversation to bring attention to an individual or group's harmful words or behaviors, including bias, prejudice, microaggressions, and discrimination. I would say another thing to think through if you feel like you are experiencing bias in the workplace is document all interactions with that individual, whether it be a coworker that you're having some issues with, whether that be a manager or any other leader in the organization. You want to make sure that you are documenting those interactions so that if you need to take more, I would say, formal action, you have something to that's documented. Advocate for pay transparency, as well as ask for feedback when interviewing for internal jobs. So a lot of times we see bias, like I mentioned, in promotions, right? So you may apply for a job and keep applying for jobs. I have a situation I'm dealing with right now at work where an individual has applied for 10 jobs in the organization and she's way qualified for those jobs. So we're trying to figure out why is she not getting offered these opportunities. And definitely think there's some bias there. So definitely I would say one thing you can do to navigate that is to maybe ask for that feedback when interviewing for internal jobs. Okay, exploring microaggressions. So defining microaggressions, racial microaggressions are the brief and everyday slights, insults, and indignities sent by well-intentional people who are unaware of the hidden messages that they communicate. So you may have seen, some of these microaggressions when people ask, a simple question, where are you from? And you say, I'm from New York. And they may say, no, where are you really from? And that's happened to me quite a bit. People don't think I'm from America for some reason. They have some sort of thought that I'm from the Caribbean or was born in Africa. So that I have experienced this type of microaggression a couple of times here. So I'm going to move on to the types of microaggressions. So there's micro invalidations. That is when a person's comment invalidates or undermines the experience of a marginalized group. Micro assaults is when a person intentionally behaves in a discriminatory way while not intending to be offensive. Example could be telling a racist joke and then saying I was just joking. And then micro insults happens quite frequently. I'm actually dealing with one that just happened recently on my job, where a verbal, nonverbal, and environmental communication that slightly conveys rudeness and insensitivity that demean a person's racial heritage or identity. So I'll give you a really quick example. One of our high-ranking officer in my organization made a comment about the metrics we have around hiring diversity. And they mentioned that we're not going to lower our hiring standards in order to bring more diverse people into the organization, right? So there's definitely some microaggressions and biases there, but just wanted to give you that example of what a micro insult can be. Types of microaggressions: loss of self-esteem, feelings of exhaustion, increased stress levels, anxiety, depression, all of these things, especially when microaggressions happen repeatedly. These are some things that could be happening to us. So sometimes when you're experiencing a microaggression, you may experience some of these internal dilemmas and you're not really sure how or if you want to respond in the moment. So some things you may be going through internally. Did she say what I think she just said, or should I say something? Or did I really interpret that correctly? So those are some things that you could be wrestling with, right? And when you're faced with a racial microaggression. So some productive responses, I would say is one, take a deep breath. I recommend if you are upset or emotional, you may want to walk away, and it may not be the best time to address the interaction. Also, assume that the offense was not the intent. Hopefully it's in some cases, I know it could be malicious, but in most cases it's just pure, people are just not aware. So ask yourself, will further conversation with this individual or group be beneficial and productive? What is your current level of stress? Do you feel psychologically safe to have this discussion, without a third party present? And most important, you want to practice self-care. Can't reiterate that enough as we're talking through this conversation, is making sure that you're taking care of yourself. So, quick action planning tool that I recommend as you're thinking through, and I totally understand that you may not necessarily always be in a position to react this way and so systemically, but think about asking clarifying questions to the individual. Carefully listen to their response. Sometimes we're so upset that we can't really hear the message. Maybe talk to someone else about it, right? Maybe having a conversation with someone before you respond might be helpful. Explore the impact. Ask for or state the potential impact of such a statement or action on others. Also own your own thoughts and feelings. And also think about what that next step is going to be. What is that appropriate action that should be taken? Is this truly a learning opportunity for the individual? Or is this behavior or action repeated, right? Maybe you already had a conversation with someone and they're still repeating these offenses, right? So maybe at that point, you may want to consider escalating the situation to, if it's a work situation, to someone of authority. I know I flew through that because we are way, way over our time. And Michelle, I will make sure I get you a resource guide that you can share with the audience with all this information as well after. But we do have recommended books to continue your journey, because I always call this a journey. These discussions, there's never a right or wrong, but it's a journey, and we're all in different stages and places in our journey. So there's some books on microaggressions, racial trauma healing, dealing with bias. We have some podcasts as well. as well as some recommended movies and videos. And I don't know if we have time, but we can open it up for questions if we do. Oh, sorry.
Yep, Shireen. So yeah, if we could take 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. Yep. Any questions?
I think I saw a hand up.
Yep, I see one hand raised. Go ahead.
Me? Is it me? Because I'm not signed on as myself. I'm signed on as Colin.
Oh, yes. I guess it's you, Sujatha. I can't
How
tell.
are you? Hi, Shireen. I wanted to just, you had said something about, assuming it wasn't intentional, or is it a learning opportunity or whatever. And I know why you say that. I understand why you say that. I think that part of it for us, for anybody, and I'm not even Black, but it happens to me all the time. Like just the other day, somebody started greeting me in Hindi and then got offended that I don't speak Hindi, and you should speak Hindi. I speak Hindi. I'm like, why would I speak Hindi? And went on and a whole party, and it's embarrassing, and people were leaving because they were so embarrassed that this person was going on and all like that. And I think especially for Black Americans in America, of which I am not, right? The exhaustion comes from assuming good intentions and from thinking it's and white people assuming that they can use these Black people and their friends who they don't mean any harm, they certainly don't, but that they can use them for learning experiences. And the exhaustion comes, it seems to me anyway, from my friends, like the exhaustion comes from a never ending learning experience. And you have to be always like, okay with it. I gotta be okay with it, because what choice do you have? And like, even when you were talking about the workplace stuff and being safe to bring up your concerns, women don't feel safe to bring up concerns when they're being harassed by men. Black people certainly don't feel, safe to bring it, because, your job is just like you said, this person mightily qualified for a job that she can't get, It's like, what do I have to do beyond being better, but I have to be willing to be okay with this, because if I make people uncomfortable, it's harder for me to get a job. So that makes it a bazillion times harder to even deal with this, with what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally echo and agree with the comments that you made, Sujatha. It is exhausting. Yeah, so yes, to agree with everything you said.
So I'm just saying that because it's a lot of people here who might be hearing that. And, I'm just saying, again, because I'm not Black, I always feel like since I'm not Black, I can sort of say, maybe just like use some caution, because that is, Black people very often will not tell you when you are wearing them out. They will not tell you when you are wearing them out. So I'm here to tell you sometimes you're wearing them out. And I'm saying that because I'm Black. So it's just like sometimes you are wearing people out. So maybe like do some introspection first before you just come ask me. You can ask me, will this wear my friends out? And I will let you know if it will wear your friends out, because it might,
Very, very good point. And one of the other things I'll just add on to that too is the importance of educating, our allies, I'll say, is important of educating yourselves too. And if someone does not necessarily take your comment as unintentional or good intent, and if they do get upset, not necessarily trying to figure out from that individual, maybe do your own work, internal work and research and understand. Because I think one of the other things that happens is we are constantly having to teach, and we want to make sure that because that gets exhausting as well, right? When we're constantly asked those questions. So very well point taken.
I would suggest the book White Fragility. It helps with some of that, I think.
Absolutely.
Yolanda says she is exhausted.
One more question?
We have time for one more question.
Okay. So I was at a community meeting in a Black community, and the folks were talking about the county
disrespecting him in certain regards, and was a pretty heated discussion. And the white supervisor said, well, I didn't intend to disrespect you. And I kind of put my head in my hands and said, that's not going to work. Can you give me a reaction what you say when people, what you think when people say, well, I didn't intend to do that, with the kind of supposition that that means you shouldn't be upset about it?
I don't think I followed it was cutting out a little bit for me. I don't
the
think I
lack of
heard.
an excuse, because things were done. I mean, there was a lot of evidence.
Mary, you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
Yeah, so we can't, we didn't follow the entire.
okay, never mind. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
Sorry.
Any other discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. Like, how do you deal with folks when they say, hey, I didn't mean to do whatever, but, you know, and so, you know, that's their excuse, right? What's a good comeback for that? Well, I didn't mean to offend you. Why are you offended?
So I think it's impact versus intent, right? So just because you didn't offend, you don't think you offended me, right? What did that impact have on me? So I think that is a good way to respond to that. I personally used that tactic before in work situations where someone made a comment about urban crime, and the way that story went, it was going down a racial path, right? So their comment to me was, you're being sensitive. That was not what I meant. And I said, well, this is the impact that had on me and my lived experience and how I grew up in the community that I live in, and how those words are harmful. So I think that is one way that you can address when someone says they didn't mean, or they didn't intend to. It's that impact versus intent. Just because you don't think you meant to, that did impact me.
This is such a great discussion. I really hate to cut it off. But we thank you, Shereen and Kofi. Just amazing, riveting. You guys have to come back. I see lots of questions and comments in the chat. I will save the chat, and I'll make sure that we get your website out to everyone. But thank you again for coming. And of course, I know that you'll answer my calls when I call, so I'm not worried about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sorry we went way over our time.
That's okay. It's really okay.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We have to get back to the business. We have a few more things to go over before we go into committee breakouts. I don't want to cut those off tonight because there is a lot going on amongst the committees. I am going to push off our secretary's minutes. I think we didn't get those out in time anyway, so we will cover those in March, as well as the treasurer report. We will cover that in March as well. But there is still a lot going on in the branch that I do want to cover or do need to cover. Let's see. We have some vacant positions. I think we talked a little bit in January about some of the committees that are without a chair. And I don't mean to beg, but I'm going to beg tonight. We really do need to fill our health chair, the health committee. With the end of the pandemic, or the seeming end of the pandemic, there's a lot of work to be done mental health wise. There's, we still have maternal health equity issues that we need to address. And so we definitely need a health committee chair. So if you know anyone who's interested, we certainly would prefer someone who works in the healthcare field. Or you can work in health policy. And environmental and climate justice chair, we're still looking for that. And then we have a couple of committees that we have someone from the NAACP sit on. And one of those teams is called the Successful Children and Youth Policy Team. It is a Fairfax County policy team dealing directly with education policy. We had someone sitting in that role, but they are no longer able to perform the position. So we are looking for someone to fit on that team. They do meet during the day, which could be something that may hinder some people from doing, but I don't think they meet every month. I think they meet every other month. I think they meet on a Wednesday at 10 a.m. We have 2 positions on the Criminal Justice Advisory Board. We have 1 position filled, and so we have another position that's open. And then finally, on the political action front, we need some folks focused on the county budget. You would sit on the political action committee team, but you would be focused on the county budget. As you know, they just put out the draft budget, and so we definitely need folks to follow it all the way through and make sure that the issues and concerns of Fairfax and NAACP are represented in that budget. So if there's any interest at all, please contact me. Like I said, I'm not begging, but I'm begging. And then also coming up, we talked a little bit about what happened in the police incident last week, where a man was killed, Timothy Johnson. We are holding a vigil for him on Friday at the Fairfax County Government Center. And then we're also having a community conversation around policing next week on Thursday, March 9th at 7. You should have gotten the flyer for the community conversation. The visual information will either go out tonight or tomorrow. And also in that visual information, there will be a GoFundMe. We are trying to raise money to make sure that his family can bury him, and hopefully also have some funding left over, because he does have 2 kids, I believe 12 and 9 years old. So look out for the visual information. Like I said, it's Friday at 5 o'clock in front of the Fairfax County Government Center. The General Assembly wrap up. They have Virginia State Conference has been following the bills on the General Assembly very closely. You've probably seen some of our action alerts over the last few weeks. So they are having a General Assembly wrap up this Sunday, March 5th at 7. If you're interested, there is the registration link is there. We'll also get this out to you as well. So you'll see that in the newsletter upcoming events. We probably will send out tomorrow or Thursday. Like I said, we'll save the secretary's report and the treasurer's report for our next meeting. Do we have any new or old business? Anything that you were expecting to hear that you didn't hear? Any? Who was that?
Yeah, this
Oh, Mary. Okay, go ahead, Mary.
is Mary. Can I make one announcement?
Sure.
I know my connection's bad.
I can hear you now, though. Go ahead.
You should be getting in the next week. Okay, you should be getting in the next week.
Mary, turn your video
a request to sign on to our. I'll turn the video off.
There you go.
We're going to be sending out requests for people to comment on a series of fair housing goals that are out for public comment over this next month. We're putting out a petition of what we'd like to see in the fair housing goals, and to other organizations, and asking them to sign on. And we're going to send out to members these goals, and also ask people to sign on and comment on them. Housing Committee's been working on this for some time. The Metro Council of Governments came up with the 5 goals in consultation with 8 jurisdictions, including Fairfax County. And each jurisdiction was supposed to come up with an action plan under those goals. And Fairfax County only came up with 2 actions, which is indicating that they didn't put much thought into this. So we're going to try to help them think it through and suggest some things that they should put in as actions for fair housing goals. So watch out for that communication.
Mary, was that it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we'll get that out also as an action alert. Any other new business, new or old business?
Michelle, this is Mike O'Brien. I don't know if it sounds like you hadn't planned to say anything about the Timothy Johnson situation, but I do urge everybody to look at the statement that you came out with yesterday. I think it's a very strong statement, and I think we are holding and plan to hold the county officials, responsible for.
Yeah, there will be a statement going out to the members tonight or tomorrow. Yeah, so that information will go out. And if there are any questions, if you get any media calls, please refer them to our communications team, communications@fairfaxnaacp.org. And I'll just remind you that the only person who can speak for the branch is the president. So I know I've gotten lots of media requests, and the media, they don't care who they talk to, so they could reach out to members. But if you could refer them to communications, that would be great.
Are there any more facts that are, do we know any more than what's already been put out to us
No.
by you, Michelle?
No.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Absolutely. But right now we're really trying to support the family. So if you can come out to the vigil, that would be great. And just show the family that we're behind them.
When was that vigil? Remind me.
Sure. It's Friday.
Oh, that's right.
Let's see. March 3rd. I can't believe it's March already. I have to actually go back and look. It's Friday, March 3rd. And we'll begin at 5 o'clock. And we're literally in that center lawn right in front of the government center. Okay, well, if there's no other business, I am going to adjourn the meeting. We are going to have committee breakouts. If you want to hear more about what's going on in the committees, please join the breakout rooms. And also I will stay on if anybody is interested in any of those positions I was talking about. Our next meeting is on March 28th. It is virtual. And then our April meeting, April 25th, is in person. So please book your schedules for that. We're going to have some great refreshments. We're going to have some great speakers out on April 25th. So please mark your calendars for that.
President Lee?
Yes.
I had a quick announcement.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Berry. I'm running for the House of Delegates in the 7th District. My campaign launch is on March 25th. It's free and open to the public. I'll put the information in the chat, and if you're interested in learning more, please reach out.
Thank you, Paul. Any other announcements?
Michelle Lee?
Yes, Marianne, I think I saw your hand first.
Thank you. Don't forget on March 14th in Mount Vernon, there will be a hearing for the History and Social Studies Standards of Learning. The Department of Education and the Board of Education will be taking input. And I don't know if you've been following that, but they're whitewashing the history that will be taught to our children, and it's very important that we push back. So please plan on coming or submitting statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Chris?
Hi, President Lee. Thanks for a moment to speak. Thank you all for letting me be a visitor tonight in this meeting. These were very powerful conversations, so I've been doing more listening than speaking. But my name is Chris Falcon. I'm running for Fairfax Clerk of the Circuit Court in this year's election. I've been an attorney here in Virginia for the past 15 years, and the last 8.5 of those I've spent working for the circuit court system. During that time, I've also been very active in our legal aid community, and I think there's a lot that we need to do in Fairfax County to provide greater access to justice for the people that live in this county. And that starts with providing greater access to the legal aid organizations and the resources that are out there to this community. That's something we've been doing in Arlington where I work, and I'm going to bring it here to Fairfax. If you're interested in learning more about our campaign, I'll put our website address in the chat, but thank you again for letting me be part of this.
Sure, thank you, Chris. Do I see another raised hand? Oh, Molly, go ahead.
Hi.
How are you?
Hi, how are you doing? Thanks. I just wanted to say, introduce myself. I know most of you from having been working with you over the years, but I'm Shamali Houth, and I am running for delegate in the 8th Congressional District. This is the same one that Paul Berry is running in. This is a new open seat where Ken Plum is no longer running for re-election. We have a lot of events coming up, but one of the things that I think that is most important to address is mental health issues. And it's one of the ones that I'm going to truly focus on: mental health, housing, and the climate. And I think many of the other things that I really care about, transgender rights, criminal justice reform, making sure we're supporting the disability community, education, all of that is things that are intersectional with those top three. And so I really enjoyed the discussion tonight on policing. This is really fantastic. Thank you very much for putting that together. I look forward to getting to know you all better, having you get to know me, and inviting you to my kickoff once we set the date.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's great to see so many of you running for office. Okay, so with that, I am going to adjourn the meeting if I don't have any other announcements at 8:51. Please stick around for our committee breakouts. You always learn more in there. And I'm sure our education chair is still on, Sajatha. I will be talking a little bit about what's going on with the Timothy Johnson case. If you want to come over and spend a little bit of time talking about what we do know, I'm happy to do that. And I think most of our committee chairs are here. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms, and then you can move into any room that you want. Thank you for joining us tonight. Yeah, it was a good meeting. We try to have some good meetings.
Oh, click join breakout room. Oh.
I couldn't find them at first. I'm sorry, I got confused.
Do you see them now, Sajatha?
I see them. I was like, where are we?
It would help if you can find the room and
There we
go
go.
into it.
There we go. Okay, here
That
we
would
go.
help a little bit.
Michelle, is there a room for voting?
No, because you know what? Our political action chair, Karen Camblin, is actually at another meeting. So yeah, she's not here.
Okay, have a good night.
Night. Luke, are you still on? I see people in your justice room.
Michelle, you're still recording. I didn't know if you knew that.
Oh, please stop me. Oh, thank you so much. Before I say something that shouldn't be on the recording. Thank you.
How do I get to a breakout room?
You should see, there should be, like, I have a window up. I can't tell what you see it.